So the talks, as many people have heard me say before, especially those listening and watching YouTube videos, the talks are about something very specific. In practical terms, they're about happiness for the human being in daily living. Not happiness in the next life or happiness in the unmanifest, but happiness for the human being in daily life. That's actually the only topic that's spoken about, and all of the concepts that are put forward are only relevant as they relate back to this topic. So happiness for the human being is better described as peace of mind, continuous, unbroken peace of mind, regardless of the circumstance you find yourself in. So that's what the talks are about. Happiness, more accurately, peace of mind in daily living. And that peace of mind is a way of being in relation to life, meaning whatever situation you find yourself in, moment after moment. Having missed your aeroplane, having ordered a particular dish and not got what you ordered, a friend doing something kind for you, a friend letting you down, getting an email saying that you've lost your job, or being called in and told you've lost your job, getting a promotion. The flow of life, circumstance, is always going to be a mix of pleasure and pain. And what we receive in each moment, pleasure or pain, not in our control, dependent on the circumstance. And the circumstance is very complex and not something we control. We can't dictate how the other acts. We can't determine what the weather's like and whether a virus breaks out in another country and affects our plans to travel there or from there. We can't determine whether we get sick or whether we wake up healthy in the morning. And so when we look more closely at the flow of life, we see that even though some things turn out the way we would like, we're ultimately not in control, because at any point in time, things can and do turn out not as we would like. And often we look at life with a sort of blinkered view and see the times that we do something and the outcome is as we would like, and we say, oh, I'm in control. And then on the odd occasion it doesn't work out, we don't say, I'm not in control. Something went wrong, but I'm ultimately in control. And next time I'll make sure that I control the situation a bit better. And it's a bit like tossing a coin and saying that when you call heads and heads come, that's because I was in control. And then when you call heads and tails come, you might sort of admit, okay, in that case I wasn't in control. The truth is, in neither case are you in control. Sometimes you get what you like, and sometimes you don't. So this needs to become one of the attitudes we have towards life. It's a realistic, it's a actual seeing things as they are. So by all means, we will function according to our design. So we could say, do your best, which really means you will function in each moment according to your design. So there's no reason for a belief to set in and say, oh, well, I'm not in control, so I might as well do nothing. It's not saying that. It's saying in each moment we're going to find ourselves in a circumstance, we're going to function a certain way, but understand that the outcome is not in our control. Now, to the entity that believes that its completeness is dependent in outcomes, that's not something it likes to hear. it sort of freaks out. It has an existential crisis if it hears that I'm not in control, because it suddenly means, according to its belief of who it is and what it needs in order to be complete, that notion is very challenging. But the good news is that what we really are, beyond or prior to our psychological identity that's formed as part of who we are, a part that tends to be able to override some other parts of who we are. The good news is, beneath that set of beliefs of who we are, there is a core or an essence to the human being. Not a core or an essence to some human beings and not others, but every human being has at their core an aspect or a quality that means that our happiness, our completeness, is not dependent on outcomes. And once there is a dropping into that, a connecting to that, which these are sort of words, descriptors, it doesn't necessarily mean it's exactly that, because we don't, there's essentially a dropping away of a barrier. A barrier is a certain type of thinking and outlook on life. As that becomes weaker and weaker, we can become more connected, or this core I'm speaking can become more revealed. And there is a first-hand confirmation. What I am doesn't require my friend to treat me a certain way. Doesn't require people to have this opinion of me and not that opinion of me. It's independent of that. And so we can find that we can start to appreciate, I am. I am is a term that is essentially pointing to the fact, I am, full stop. Not I am because of this or because of that. I am, and that core, that sense of existence, that existence prior to thinking yourself into existence, that existence prior to outcomes, just is. So we don't need to create it, we don't need to grow it or wait for it to develop. But there is something that gets in the way of it shining, let's say. And that's what is referred to as the thinking mind. And if we start to see that the thinking mind is the veil, is the obstacle, then the working mind, it's the working mind that recognizes that. The working mind, in conjunction with awareness, can see the thinking mind in action. And especially when the thinking mind gets cut off and we find ourselves dropping into what you could call another dimension of the human being, another gear, when we find that dropping happening in, and there is in that moment a qualitative shift from the uncomfortableness of the thinking mind, the uncomfortableness of the narrative that includes in it this I need this and that, I am this and that. And so there is an inherent uncomfortableness with self in the thinking mind. And once the working mind has received descriptions that point out that that small self, that self-identity, which is essentially a living life on the level of thought and interpreting what's happening in life through that lens of thinking, once another part of the human being, the working mind, is equipped with that information, there can start to be a cutting off of the thinking mind and a dropping into this other place. And in that moment, there's a qualitative shift, and that qualitative shift starts to demonstrate a lot to us. It demonstrates that it is the thinking mind that is the obstacle, and a dropping into being where essentially the thoughts are suspended or discarded as nonsense or not truth, a false sense of self. So once there is sufficient motivation in the system, sufficient understanding that the thinking mind is essentially the obstacle to, let's call it our true nature, but it's just a word. So I'd rather say an aspect of myself that is already complete, and in the absence of that self-image, we can say, oh, this is what I am, not that. So the cutting off of the thinking mind and dropping into being reveals what I'm describing. That we can rest in our own being and find ourselves much less affected by circumstance than was previously our experience. And so that becomes a great motivation. Intuitively, seeking is happening because intuitively it's known that suffering is not the only way. We actually find this peace in deep sleep each night. In deep sleep, we're free from the psychological suffering. So intuitively we know that this isn't the only way, the only option. Now, in deep sleep, it's not happiness in daily life. It's peace in a much broader sense. Not that it's better. It's a different form where nothing is really there. And sometimes people assume that's what liberation is. They have some ideas because the emptiness, the nothingness, the sort of prior to manifestation, which deep sleep can be a representation of, the end of the individual, but it's the end of everything. And sometimes people are thinking, that's the goal. That if I still the mind enough, I'll find myself there or not there with nothing, as nothing, knowing the source, let's say, which is often described as nothing. And I'd say, well, that to me is not what freedom, liberation is about. I'd say it's about finding ourselves at peace while daily life is still there, while the body is still functioning in daily life. Because at the end of the day, my suggestion is after liberation, you still have to live your life for the rest of your life until the body dies, in practical terms. And if we find this peace coming in and we see that it is actually just the absence of guilt, blame, pride, worry and anxiety, expectation and attachment to outcomes, we find ourselves sitting there, maybe, at a cafe is a good example, I like that, and nothing particular is happening, nothing particularly special, no special states or no dissolving into nothingness or no oneness experience. Those things can happen as states and changes, and they're very, they can be what you could say interesting and pleasant and nice, profound even. But there's this other version, which is you're sitting there, nothing particularly impressive, but you feel comfortable sitting there. Not comfortable as in a pleasurable, comfortable feeling, the chair is comfortable, but a comfortableness with oneself, which really, when you look at it, is there isn't a problem. There isn't a psychological problem. There isn't a yearning for something different. There isn't the blaming the other for what they did in the past or feeling inadequate for how you functioned in the past. There isn't even pride for things that worked out well. No anxiety or worry. There's what you could call a quietness, a stillness of mind, and all of those other functionings, which take different forms. It could be boredom, it could be restlessness, all of those other forms of movement of the mind, which in concentrated forms feel like not thinking, but feel like feelings of uncomfortableness. They're not there. And so no mind, or the end of thinking, quiet mind, stillness, can often be misinterpreted because it isn't assumed to be that simple. So we might be waiting for no mind or stillness where it's so profoundly, radically different that the simple, ordinary peace of mind that is really so precious and the jewel in the crown, and the manifestation in practical terms of knowing oneself and not having forgotten oneself, that simple peace can be overlooked. And if two dogs come running in, they knock the table and your drink falls over, then that's part of the circumstance, and you can say, okay, well, that's pain in the moment. It's not in line with your biological preferences, which still exist when we find ourselves often, maybe all the time in life, feeling this comfortableness. The dogs come in, knock over the drink. We move to not get splashed by the drink that's falling off the table, let's say. So the biological reactions happen. Pain, because you're looking forward to finishing your drink or having your drink, whatever. Maybe it did spoil your clothes. That happened. You can't deny that. Then with this stillness, the stillness is dependent on what we say this means about who I am, and how long that uncomfortableness, if there is a narrative that says this situation was problematic to who I am, if that is there, it depends on how long it remains. So if the pain in the moment happens and there is an acceptance that this is life working, this is not life not working. When we have an idea that life shouldn't turn out that way, then we have the idea, tell those dogs to stop barking, goddammit. Then, it can take us time to adjust to what happens if we have this expectation that we think life needs to be pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. If we expect the unexpected, if we know that life is always a mix of pleasure and pain, that whenever anything happens, it fits into that categorization of the flow of life. Sometimes pleasure, sometimes pain. And then automatically the thought can arise, that's life. Doesn't mean it's great news for our new pair of trousers, let's say. But that's life. And the quietness can remain. So for as long as awareness doesn't land on what's being described, essentially we continue to function the way we always have, and that way of functioning is quite possibly reinforcing the beliefs that are at the root of the uncomfortable functioning, the uncomfortable attitude towards life. Because every time the attitude of blame towards the other for what they have done that has delivered pain, that is taken as an attack on oneself, every time that blame arises and it isn't seen, essentially that blame is saying, yes, my happiness is to be found in outcomes. I have been diminished in this moment by this outcome. So for as long as these dynamics aren't described, life doesn't give us these descriptions, they go rationalized in the way that we've rationalized them in the past, which means we see them one way, the way that has allowed them to persist. So the simple seeing of the blame arise is fantastic. If we insist on it not arising, then we have another expectation of how life should be in that moment. And that expectation will create a resistance against, or a resistance towards the blame arising. I shouldn't blame, that is disturbing my peace of mind. And that's not getting us any closer to peace of mind. It's actually adding an extra layer of the stuff that is obscuring the peace of mind. So to the extent we become interested in seeing these movements, especially the movements that are described as one's attitude to life, which is the layer on which the suffering exists and the layer on which the peace exists when the suffering falls away. So to the extent we become interested in observing the landscape that previously wasn't observed with these descriptors, that's when things start to change. And the good news is that this can become an observation that happens often throughout the day without you needing to take time out as a spiritual practice. Because the reaction is going to happen when you're in the shops, when you're on the road, when you're at work, when you're with your friends and your family, when you're interacting with strangers, business colleagues. So the sadhana, the spiritual practice, that is engaged in as a practice that you do for an hour a day in order to get somewhere, to me is not a great sadhana. It might be the only thing that's appropriate for some people at a certain point in time, given their makeup. So I'm not saying it's absolutely not appropriate, but when our sadhana becomes something spontaneous, and it's about an investigation of what is in life, and especially an investigation focused on the dynamics of suffering that interfere with our peace of mind, then there's a sustained and regular seeing, and that's what brings about change. Especially change of something that's deeply ingrained. You can't really expect something deeply ingrained to change just because it's seen once. And even when it's seen once, sometimes it's seen once with great insight, which is a deeper seeing than is normally available. It's a sort of seeing that sees many layers and many interconnectednesses about a certain topic, and even that insight, in my view, is not enough to just collapse the dynamic. It becomes a very important part of collapsing the dynamic, because the dynamic is seen more deeply and with more detail. And yet there tends to need to be an integrating and more than just the insight.
So when you see this flame rising, do you feel it completely, or then do you just step out and see it?
Well, there's about three or four different relationships that can happen towards the arising of the psychological reactions, which are the guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. So in this particular framework, the movement of mind that is based on the two false senses of self, the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome. Anything that arises from there is referred to as a psychological reaction. So psychological doesn't just mean thinking. It means thinking of a certain thought, of a certain type. What is referred to as the thinking mind in this teaching, the thinking mind based on doership and attachment to outcomes, referred to as psychological reactions in the moment. There are also biological reactions in the moment, like the swatting of a mosquito that just bit you, for example, and it's based on not your attitude of doership and attachment to outcome, but a biological reaction. There's the biological reaction of hunger and tiredness, the biological reactions of feeling hot or cold, and also the working mind, which is thinking about what groceries you need to buy, when to order a taxi, how much money to take with you on holiday, when to book things. So that functional thinking doesn't fit under the category of psychological reaction, but biological reaction. So hopefully it becomes clear. Someone might say, how come thinking about when to book a taxi, and how come that's not a psychological reaction? Because psychological isn't referring to all thinking, and biological to just the biological functions of the physical body, but rather we're saying biological reaction is the thinking, feeling, and functioning of the person, which includes body and mind, that isn't suffering. So anything that isn't suffering, biological reaction. Anything that is suffering, psychological reaction. So when we describe the human being as on a biological and psychological level, on a level of their biological and psychological functioning, that is a result of the biological instrument that we are. And the biological instrument is described as being a result of two factors: our genetic makeup, the blueprint that got put in place at conception, and the up-to-date conditioning, which is a result of all of the new conditioning delivered moment after moment after moment in life. So that says what I am on a biological and psychological level, what Roger is on a biological and psychological level, is a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning. And that applies, that's what I was in every moment, because my up-to-date conditioning is always changing based on the new conditioning coming in. So when I was 10 years old, I was a result of my gene structure that grew, and the gene structure grew never in isolation, but always in the presence of new conditioning being delivered by life, and by life a lot of it is delivered through parents, family, friends, schools, teachers, religious teachers. And all of that new conditioning, delivered moment after moment, impacts the growth, or becomes part of the growth of the genetic structure. And so then we can see ourselves as a hugely complex biological organism, biological and psychological organism. The psychological part is a result of very specific conditioning that has developed these two core beliefs about who I am, the belief in personal doership and the belief in attachment to outcomes. And then there's a whole lot of other new conditioning that's delivered by life that develops other parts. So language is because of conditioning. How to use a knife and fork is conditioning. How to wash yourself is conditioning. So let's not make the classic mistake of saying, the problem in life is conditioning. Because if you pray to God for all of your conditioning to be removed, you will have problems in life. You won't be able to function. So when we start looking at it more closely, we say, it's the conditioning that has led to the ingrained beliefs of doership and attachment to outcome. That's the problem relative to peace of mind. We might have conditioning that is problematic to our pleasure and pain, and that can get changed in other areas of life. So you can go to grammar school, and that will deliver new conditioning that may improve your up-to-date conditioning, which affects how you write and how you speak. But that's not what this is so focused on. This is more focused on looking at the suffering. So your question is, when the suffering arises, so I had to give some background before answering the question, sorry. When the suffering arises and it's witnessed, or it's registered, it's seen, I'm blaming, and blame is someone has done something in the past, or right now, but it's now become the past once it's been done, that has their actions, the outcome, delivered pain to me or someone I love, and I am blaming them for having delivered the pain, seeing that pain as an attack on who I am. So that's where the attachment to outcomes kicks in. That pain is an attack on who I am. And you as the doer, you as the one in control of everything you think, feel, say and do, should have and could have acted differently. So you hurt me, you attacked my completeness, is how it's received, and I hate you, you should have acted differently. So when your best friend starts going out with your ex-boyfriend, let's say, that blame could come up. So the circumstance is painful. Pain is delivered, and then the attitude to the circumstance can be this narrative of blame. And we might, if we're lucky, see that blame, see it as an attitude to the circumstance and not the circumstance itself. The circumstance is best friend going out with ex-boyfriend, painful. The attitude is different to the circumstance. So the circumstance, and then our attitude is, this is an attack on who I am. You could have and you should have been different. So if we're lucky, the up-to-date conditioning will see that as blame and see it as a disturbance to our peace of mind. Then several things can happen. The working mind can investigate this and see that yes, there's blame, and it is based on my attitude that my best friend could be different, that the story of life could and should be different, and that this story is life not working, or it's not possible. This is how life is meant to be, let's say. So it can be investigated using the framework. That's one valid movement towards the blame. And investigated means we get to see the nuances that are spoken about, the pleasure or pain in the flow of life because of the circumstance, the attitude, that the attitude is based on doership and attachment to outcome, seeing that it's blame or shame or expectation. So basically a unpicking of the situation, and the unpicking of the situation relative to the concepts actually strengthens our understanding of the concepts, strengthens the understanding of the dynamic that happened. That can be very powerful. It might not bring the suffering to an end, but that's not really the purpose of spiritual seeking. If we're seeking as an antidote to suffering in the moment, we've got it sort of all wrong. The seeking may one day, not in our control, deliver the end of suffering, but it's not really meant to be, oh, let me use it now to bring this suffering to the end. If that's what it is, it's really the doer holding on to a tool that it hopes it can use to control life. And in that meaning, control suffering. I just want suffering to end. And the teaching says, I'm sorry, it's not in your control. Right? But life can deliver new conditioning that can bring that to an end, but it brings it to an end not because you as the doer make it happen on your own timetable, but rather because a gradual change where these attitudes get uprooted happens. As a result of new conditioning, you're contemplating along the new conditioning, and the contemplating itself is new conditioning because all of the insights you have is new conditioning, and it can diminish and bring an end to the suffering. So really, if the investigation comes in only when suffering arises, and then when the suffering is not in its intense form, we are more interested in seeking pleasure, and there's no seeking or no inquiry, we've got a few problems because there's no capacity, no space to see things clearly when suffering arises. Usually when suffering arises, there's the least space available. So this inquiry needs to come in when there's no real strong suffering, and there can be the inquiry towards the biological pleasures and pains that are arising. And as we investigate when the suffering isn't there, when it is there, there is much more capacity and space to witness the suffering as a happening because of the... So hopefully people don't find themselves seeking just when they feel bad. Like they pray to God only when they feel bad. Please fix this situation for me. So the framework is one way. Once the framework starts to set in, another response to the suffering can happen, which is a much more spontaneous response. So blame is happening, it gets seen, and the thought arises. My happiness isn't to be found in circumstances, or my happiness isn't to be found in pleasure or pain. And that's a thought that in it includes a lot of understanding because of the previous inquiry. And it cuts off the story because the reason it's arisen, my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, is because of the inquiry that has seen seeing things more clearly. And so in that thought there is all of the understanding which can allow a dropping into being. And there can be a relief from that blame because it just gets cut off in the moment. So that's the second response. So none of these are things that you should do, but rather they're descriptions of how the understanding, when it starts to sink in, starts to act or starts to function. Both, to me, very helpful progressions of things. The third way is to witness what is arising, which means a seeing of the blame as a psychological reaction arising in a body-mind organism, understanding that that is not your doing. Not your doing because it's arising based on the biological instrument in that moment, which includes the biological and the psychological conditioning, and it's automatic. It's not something you choose to do, it's just a happening. So from that point of view, the suffering can be witnessed where there isn't an involvement in it, which really means the doership aspect that is trying to insist it's not there and do something about it has fallen away, and there's just a quiet witnessing, which isn't something, definitely not something you're doing, but one of these movements that can happen. The second one that I mentioned, where the suffering gets cut off, my happiness isn't to be found in the flow of life, and we drop into being. Here I am. You know, for a moment I forgot who I am, that I am, even in the face of this painful situation, and you drop into your being. So one, investigation of the concepts, dropping into being, witnessing the suffering, which is not so much dropping into being, but more dropping into yourself as formless awareness in which everything is arising. And so there is a seeing of the suffering arising as a happening in the biological instrument. And the fourth is the opposite, in a way, of witnessing, where the feeling comes up with such intensity that what you feel like is rolling into the feeling, becoming the feeling in a sense, which means the other movements of witnessing, of cutting it off, don't happen, and instead there is a embodying the feeling, which means become the blame, or rather allow, so no concepts that blame is based on ignorance and it's a false sense of self and that it's interfering with the natural state, because those concepts, even though they are quite accurate and appropriate for some of the previous three, when it comes to the fourth, they can prevent a dropping into the feeling, and it can become a bypassing where we actually lose touch with the capacity to feel what still is in the system that needs to be felt. And so when we go into the feeling, I would suggest, so the first three tend to happen first, and then this one starts at a certain time, a certain point, and usually that point is when the understanding of non-doership has set in sufficiently, where has been enough witnessing your thoughts as a happening in a body-mind organism, your emotions arising in a body-mind organism, and understanding that sure, the emotions, certain emotions might not be pleasant, certain reactions in life, biological reactions or psychological reactions, don't necessarily deliver good outcomes, but yet you see that there's no one really doing it. There's the biological instrument designed by life to be a particular way. It can't function differently in that moment. If it was functioning differently, it would by default have a different design in that moment. So there's a circumstance, there's the instrument designed one way, and it functions one way. And once that's becoming the way that we see things, there's a capacity for this fourth movement to happen where these feelings, and they're usually feelings from the past being dragged up, can start to be felt and expressed. And the difference in doing it once this understanding has kicked in as opposed to before the understanding has kicked in, because people are very capable of feeling this and expressing it. But beforehand, there isn't really a new attitude to life. And so what is felt is what has happened in the past, and the attitude then tends to be the same attitude as the past, which doesn't release or atone or change the attitude towards the event. It may even reinforce that, you know, I really hate the person for what they've done. So what we're feeling is hatred coming up. And if in our system there isn't a new interpretation of why that circumstance happened, really why meaning it couldn't not have happened, it was part of the predetermined story of life, let's say, or it was that person functioning the only way they could. If that attitude's not there, it's going to be felt and it's going to be locked away in the same interpretation. Whereas now if we feel it, we can still feel the hatred. So the suggestion is put words onto what you're feeling. You know, put words onto, you know, I feel completely unloved and unappreciated. The situation is completely unfair. And so it's just actually the words are allowing the feeling to be verbalized, to become more full. And that doesn't mean you say, I feel completely unloved, the situation is completely unfair. It's not that, it's crying and feeling, allowing it to flower. And something in your system may watch in the same way as there has been a witnessing of these other things happening. There could be something in the system watching this immense, and it's amazing when you feel the movement of these energies, you realize how much hatred, for example, can exist in there for someone that actually you say you love, and you do on some level. So it could be a parent. And yet we see stuff that we don't realize is in the system. If we can allow it without our fear about it, which means we have to understand that this is not who we are, but rather part of that self-identity that's been locked away based on doership and attachment to outcome. And those energies are actually supporting our belief in doership and attachment to outcomes, and they're influencing the way we interpret current day situations. Now, when the emphasis is on witnessing and allowing everything as an impersonal arising, which is a very important faculty that needs to develop in our system, this fourth aspect or movement that I'm talking about seems to be out of place, and so it's often not talked about as a valid movement, because it seems like it's an involvement in circumstance, it's an involvement in... and so if the groundwork of a teaching that describes these things specifically hasn't been there, the instruction would be much better to just not get involved in it and just allow it to arise and subside and whatever. But at some point, that witnessing can become sort of almost like what we feel is the only response to things, and it can become a bypassing. it isn't at first, because it needs that needs to set in. But at some point, if that's all that happens, it becomes a sort of turning one's head away from something that actually needs to be looked at, needs to be given its space, needs to come up, and needs to be atoned. And it gets atoned once this new attitude is in place, which is an attitude of non-involvement. And so it can seem like a bit of a contradiction. I'm going to allow myself to hate fully, but that is giving the repressed energies that have been pushed down because they felt so uncomfortable in the past and there was no capacity to process them, so they were locked away in the body. This is a movement that needs to happen, and the witnessing, the atoning of it will happen sort of on its own. You don't need to worry about it too much. No, you have to use the microphone today. You don't, I can repeat the question. Go on.
What about then the place of good and bad in the whole thing?
Yeah.
Because, say for instance, like, without the whole blame and guilt and everything, is there still good and bad? Or
there is. So it's an interesting, okay. In order to bring about a break in our attachment to outcomes, the psychological attachment to outcomes, teachings have decided, rightly so, that one method of doing that is to undermine the existence of the idea of the notion of good and bad, or pleasure and pain, right and wrong, the interconnected opposites that are part of the flow of life. And the reason that that approach has been taken is because there's an understanding that the problem is attachment to outcomes, which is an attitude towards outcomes. But the attachment to outcomes is deeply ingrained. So as soon as an outcome happens, the attitude to it jumps into action. The teachings understand, okay, we are in the habit of breaking habits. We are in the business of breaking habits. So how do we break this habit that has set in place in the human being of feeling defined and being attached to outcomes, or feeling defined and therefore being attached to outcomes? Being defined means my existence depends on pleasure or outcomes is what has been put in place. And therefore we will respond to outcomes as though it's a matter of life and death. And it's a very automatic movement. So the teachings say, how do I address this? And one of the ways that they've addressed it is to say there is no such thing as good or bad. There is no such thing as pleasure or pain. These are all labels that the psychology has overlaid onto what is. What is a non-duality, and by labeling things you are collapsing it into a duality. That is ignorance, that is illusion, and what you're looking for in life is truth. What you are looking for is the end of illusion. Life is non-dual. Life is one. There is no you and the other. No pleasure and pain, no interconnected opposites. And so in stating things that way and saying you're looking for truth, the truth is life is non-dual, there is a motivation built in to the seeker to follow the instruction. And the instruction says, seeing life as good and bad is illusion, to stop doing it. Whenever you label anything as good or bad, realize it as ignorance and stop. and see it without labels. See life without labels. Now that's very important at opening up a space outside of, so this gear, this different gear to drop into. It can open up a space where we are no longer living through concepts, because that's what's happened to the human being. Is we've found ourselves living life in our head through concepts of what should and shouldn't be. That's the attachment to outcome, says this should and this shouldn't be. And as soon as we see pain, we say that shouldn't be, and as soon as we see pain, it should be all like that. And so that's what's the teachings, not just this teaching, but any teachings are trying to address, and they will do it in different ways. And starting to see life without labeling it can be a revelation to us, because we can see how we have obsessively labeled everything, and might even realize, I don't know the truth, because when I stop labeling it, I find, oh, life just is. I don't need to label it in order to make it be. It is prior to my labeling it. And so the falling away of this level of, it's a lens that we can call a relative lens, that is my interpretation of life. When that falls away, it feels like truth has been revealed. It feels like truth because what's fallen away is a lens of relativity, and the truth is described as absolute, and relative is the opposite of absolute. And so in the moment which can be called an awakening, in the moment of seeing prior to labeling, there can be a feeling, a sense, that for the first time I know what is, instead of what I have reduced what is down to based on my labeling of it. So that methodology, that instruction, it has its place. It's very powerful. It can be one methodology of moving us from head to heart, you could say, to a place of being or witnessing. Now, does that mean there is no good or bad? There is no pleasure or pain? There is no big and small? And I would say, no, it doesn't mean that. It means that the big and small, the good and bad, the hot and the cold, are interconnected opposites that make up the whole. And by temporarily ceasing to label things as good and bad, big and small, we have bypassed our automatic attachment to outcomes, and the automatic attachment to outcomes creates a separation because it is you could say that functioning is sort of quite, it's not absolute, but it takes an absolute view of things, which means it doesn't allow that view to happen and allow concurrent views to happen. So when the attachment to outcome is happening, it obscures the whole, for example. So when we temporarily suspend the interconnected opposites, or the labeling of interconnected opposites, we suspend that function of attachment and that absolutism, and what is revealed is recognition of the whole, which means a shift happens into a sort of witnessing the whole from sort of outside the whole, or on the edge of the whole. And the details, from that witnessing point of view, tend to fall away. Some of the fine details tend to fall away. And because it is said to be the seeing of reality, truth, and the description, then our thinking sort of favors that and says, well, that's reality, that's truth, and anything else is ignorance. Why that's beneficial is because it allows for a grounding into that witnessing perspective to happen, which is an important aspect that has been disabled or interfered with by the opposite labeling of things of good and bad, which creates this obsessive polarization with one side of the spectrum. So once the polarization, which is automatic and inherent in the attachment, falls away, we get to see the spectrum. But then we've stopped labeling the spectrum for what it is, which is a spectrum of interconnected opposites. And we're just watching, which doesn't actually change the spectrum from being a spectrum of interconnected opposites. We're just not labeling it. And in fact, we might then say the interconnected opposites don't exist, which is actually a new labeling that isn't seeing what is, right? So it's a little tricky in a way. And spiritual teachings tend to refine previous steps all the time. So this step is a great step to kick in, where we can see the whole, and then a refinement of that needs to happen. But before that kicks in, there's no question of refinement, and it's an important step, so it needs to kick in. So a good way of showing, so the good and bad, the pleasure and pain, exist prior to labeling relative to specific things, primarily our biological preferences, which are not psychological, they're biological. And that's why we can, when we see things as a whole, we can then realize that labeling something as pleasure or pain is not a psychological error, but it can become understanding of the landscape in a better way. So when the baby is 3 days old, 3 weeks old, it doesn't have the intellectual capacity to label things. It doesn't have language. It doesn't label things. And yet, when it's hungry, it cries. And when you jingle keys in front of it, it smiles. Because there is an inherent set of biological preferences in the baby that aren't dependent on psychological labeling. So when we say all pleasure and pain is simply a result of psychological labeling, it's a consequence, an error, that is being imposed by this very shift, which is a good shift, but a shift that has now prevented us from seeing some of the detail that still remains, and so that's where the refinement at some point has to come. Now this phenomena is the same phenomena, or the principle of this phenomena is the same principle at the root of people exclaiming, there's no one here, there's no person. It is a result of a shift that is a very profound shift. It's an error as an absolute statement, and it's a result of awareness and the intellect not recognizing exactly what has shifted and why it feels from one perspective that there's no person, but why actually we need to come back and acknowledge a person being here still. And the acknowledgement of the person is not acknowledging what we knew the person as previously, but a revised version of the person. So when someone says there's no person here, what's happened is that various shifts, insights have happened that have shown them that the person is, let's say, a result of many components, thoughts, feelings, and that those thoughts and feelings can fall away in any moment in meditations. And so they say, well, who am I if I'm here 1 minute and gone the next? Or aspects of me are gone. And they see the automatic functioning of things, that there is no one doing it. And that is a collapse of the person as we have known ourselves. So really what they're saying is, there is no person as an absolute entity, which is how I interpreted myself previously. So there's a seeing that my idea of who I was is false, it's collapsed. And yet when we look more closely, we say, well, just because the person is a result of a whole lot of layering of different factors, and that doesn't mean that that isn't a person. It just means that the person exists differently to how you originally thought. So what you're saying is, the person I thought exists doesn't exist. It doesn't necessarily mean that there is no person after liberation. So it's the I as the doer that, once an integration of those realization happens, we come back and say, well, the person is here, but I see that I'm not separate from life. I'm not a separate independent entity doing, speaking, doing, thinking, but rather all of that is happening. So there isn't a person as a separate independent doer, I agree, but there is a person that is an expression of life, and a person that is always connected to life. So we live as the person, not as everything. And we might, from a certain perspective, say, but I am everything, and I'm very happy to get a hammer and knock your knee and then knock something else and see if you practically and experientially experience a difference between one object in the everything and another object in the everything, and then that might start getting thinking to say, oh, actually, maybe everything arises in the awareness that I am, but maybe that awareness is functioning through this particular body-mind, and there's a special role of this particular object, and so a rejigging of our idea of who we are, even once certain profound shifts and experiences happen. So I don't actually know how many people here have some sense or frame of reference to what I'm talking about, and who doesn't. If people don't have a frame of reference.
Question about it.
Okay. If people don't have a frame of reference, I can understand that me jumping around saying various things can be disorienting or confusing, but for those that do have some frame of reference to what I'm talking about, then they can be helpful to hear these descriptions. And if you don't have a frame of reference, remember that I've often said it isn't so much about having these shifts. Those shifts will happen through specific teachings, and through other teachings the changes will happen in different ways. And there's many ways to the end of suffering, and they don't necessarily involve the profound experiences that we can call oneness experience or realizations of non-duality, because the root of the suffering can be undone just by simple observations of the dynamic of suffering, looking at the belief at the root of it. And so I don't know why I got onto that topic anyway. Oh, is there pleasure or pain? Yeah.
I did recently have a shift. In fact, for the past year or so, I've been having shifts, and it seems to kind of be a spiraling of bigger shifts or something. And then I'll kind of just be like I'm in normal life again, where my old being is just functioning as like, whoa, where did that go? But then it will come back, especially if I won't go into why. I think it comes back, but I seem to think that there's a process that has been started. And when you talk about drop into being, that's happening very often, sometimes after investigations, and spontaneously, and it's just very so relaxing. The body and the mind just relax. It's almost like I can't think negative thoughts, and just watching things and feeling very comfortable with life, no matter what's happening. So my question about this is, I think that a process is happening, and in a few weeks I'm going to go back to my normal place where I live and my normal life. I don't want this process to stop, and my question is, how can I, as a human being living in the world, most effectively let this process unfold?
Mm-hmm. By not putting any restrictions on it.
Yeah. Oh, that's the answer? Okay.
That might be my shortest answer in history. You see, there I go, I ruin it.
No.
What I mean is, even the idea I don't want this to stop, in a way, is a restriction on it. So the more the attitude is, life is happening. If it stops, it isn't because you have stopped it. It's not once these things start. If there is a certain earnestness, a certain interest, a certain passion that arises as part of your makeup, then it's unlikely for this to stop, because you'll find yourself continually interested. However, in that process that I'm saying is a not stopping, there are stages that feel like stops. It's the flip-flopping stage, or the process of flip-flopping. And when we go from flip to flop, it can feel like everything that I've seen and understood is completely lost. It feels like a complete regression, all the way back to where you started sometimes. And if there is an understanding inside of us, either from having seen these things happen and then it reverting back to, oh, that's a relief, that's over, that feeling of being lost, or simply because some input comes in that says that's completely normal for these flops to happen, and there could be a lot of things happening in that time on a level that you're not controlling. And furthermore, that the flop can actually be amazing food for thought for the next process. So those times can happen. And in hindsight, once we move past them, it becomes clear they're not as devastating as they can feel in the moment. Our assessment of things is usually pretty much based on how we feel in this moment, and it feels like, oh, it's never going to change, and that can be not only for the negative things, or the not negative, but where we feel stuck and things don't seem to be moving, and we say, that's it, it's stopped, it's gone, it's never going to change. Sometimes we have that same attitude towards certain insights that have happened, and it's suddenly like, oh, this is it. And it's all about whatever the insight was about. And then in hindsight, when we've had many, many insights, and we see that one insight then supports another insight, and it's not really just about that, we start saying, oh, this principle of thinking that the way that what the experience is telling me in this moment is how it's always going to be, or what it's about, is not such an accurate way of relating to that. What I think I could say that is most encouraging and accurate is that if a certain fire has been lit, that it's not going to stop.
Oh, thank you. That's really very helpful. And in fact, I was thinking this week of the metaphor of a fire, that for many years I was trying to start the fire, and that a fire has been lit. And yeah, I can just now not worry about this at all.
That's the suggestion in this teaching, is you have no homework to do when you leave. The homework, if it's going to happen, is best happen when it happens on its own. Just because you see something, a feeling arises, a psychological response, and then the homework happens when a thought arises. There's the attitude towards life that is uncomfortable. And that's not something you do, that's something that happens automatically because of your changing makeup. So that's the best thing, is that you can come to satsang if you feel like it, not worry about how the stuff that is thrown out lands. It will land or it won't, and then leave. Nothing to, and see the seeking happen automatically. And once seeking has shifted into that gear, rather than I have to make it happen, it's not happening, and there's an anxiety about it, once it shifts from one to the other, the seeking becomes much more effortless. Doesn't mean you don't find yourself maybe thinking a lot, but it's a thinking that is an effortless thinking. It's just happening. So, yeah. And that's what Nisargadatta referred to as earnestness. He said all that's needed is earnestness. Now that can be interpreted like, I need to make myself earnest. So if I saw someone and I see that they're only interested in seeking when the suffering comes in, I could say, there isn't an earnestness there. Now it's not a judgment, and it's not saying you should be earnest. It's a recognition of the way that their particular makeup is in life at the moment, is not allowing an earnestness to happen. In fact, it's forcing a non-earnestness to happen, which simply means they're interested in seeking pleasures, and when suffering comes in, then there's an interest to pick up a book on non-duality or something. Now, it isn't a criticism, it's just an observation of how life is unfolding through that person, and they can't be different. When life has changed someone, and they for themselves see that even in my dreams, I'm dreaming about seeking. My dreams become an investigation of seeking, where in the dream, the psychological suffering or the biological arising in the dream includes a commentary by the dream character. Then you know that the seeking has gone very deep. And it's not something you're doing, it's just somewhere where life has taken you. And then Nisargadatta would say, that's earnestness. Now, nothing to be proud about. If you're proud about it, there's a misunderstanding, because you're saying, look at what I'm doing, which is the very opposite of the understanding. So basically, if you find that life has lit a certain fire and there is a certain interest that doesn't feel like hard work for you to be interested, then there's earnestness.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
So, before I come to the question, I just want to say, when I hear something like what this lady just spoke about, I feel like, when is that going to happen? But that's not my question. That's just a reaction to what she just said, that sounds so amazing, like this fire that's lit and there's no effort and it's just growing. So the question is,
when is it going to happen?
without me being the doer. No, the question is that it's been many years that I've been coming to, and there's been a lot of clarity and things that one didn't know, and there was so much ignorance and there's so much light, and that's all very true. But I feel that every time I cross a certain point, somebody just picks up my goal and puts it further away, and I'm like, with all the light and the support and information, I'm still sort of challenged. So I find like I'm developing more capacity I have much more clarity and capacity, and at the same time, life is offering me more challenge somehow.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what the shit is that? So, supposed to be easier now, right? With so many years. It's like the more I can handle, the more seems to somehow also come, and I'm like, hey, hold on. It's like pushing my capacity all the time.
Well, from one perspective, it can be seen as opportunity for the next insight. Or it might, what you're feeling as challenge is got to do with the attitude that is resisting circumstance and then making it feel like more of a challenge. From a general perspective, I can say, well, whatever life delivers, if we can have an attitude that, okay, this is destiny unfolding, then it allows for the questions to fall away. And the questions tend to be a layer of uncomfortableness. So that's a view. If you say, what is this? Life is throwing more and more at me. Well, that's your destiny unfolding. Life for everyone is unfolding as it's destined to unfold. Now, life's happening, and you're describing life as it's happening for you.
No, 10 years back you said there'll be a lot of peace of mind. So
See.
I'm saying, give it to me now.
Yeah, so,
No, I'm saying, I'm just saying that, is it that it's just gonna get more intense, and because it's when one has all the tools and the clarity and then it should be, life should be a breeze.
Well, no, life won't be pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. Life will be simpler in that, not easier necessarily. You still will need to deal with the circumstantial challenges. The ease or the simplicity comes with the falling away of why and the shoulds and the shouldn'ts. So it just means, okay, one step forward, and then the next step forward, and the next step forward. That's how I have to live life. If life is completely predetermined, how should I live my life? Becomes a valid question. And the answer is, in each moment, do exactly what you think or feel to do, knowing that the outcome's not in your control, knowing that what you think or feel to do is part of destiny, as is the outcome. And if you want to look at that in a more practical way, destiny means in each moment you find yourself in a circumstance, you have a particular makeup, and what you think or feel to do is a result of your makeup in the circumstance, and you can't get it wrong. The outcome might not be in line with your preference. So you can say, well, what I did wasn't right if you're attached to the outcome. But if that falls away and says, actually, the outcome is not in my control. So that's what spiritual teachings are saying. Do your best, but don't claim ownership over the fruit of your action. So how do I live my life? And the answer is simple. In each moment, do exactly what you think or feel to do. And when you feel that answer, you say, wow, that's complete freedom. Surely I can't have complete freedom. So I'm saying, yes, you can. In each moment, the circumstance, you can't control the circumstance, but you're free in each moment to do exactly what you think or feel to do. And you can't get it wrong, because that, according to this teaching, is God's will unfolding. So, if it feels, so I mean, what I'm suggesting here is really good news, right? Saying just be free. Meaning you don't have. There's no right or wrong. And so, if there's a heaviness, you can look at what is the heaviness. And there'll be something projecting the past into the future, let's say. Because ahead of you, there is not the past. So if you come into the present moment, if a stepping out of, which is not something you can do, these sound like me telling you what to do. But they're really descriptions of what might happen. It might happen just because I suggest, are you carrying the past into the present moment? And I don't mean, is the past being carried into the present moment because of your genes and up-to-date conditioning, and is that making the present moment feel uncomfortable? Is there a problem right now? So? No problem?
Yeah. Okay.
So this isn't saying that people can insist on what their life is going to look like. So it's not saying you will have peace of mind. It's describing the potentiality of peace of mind. It's actually describing it as our birthright. Peace of mind is our birthright. Why is peace of mind our birthright? Because when we look at it, peace of mind is the absence of suffering. And when we look at the root of suffering, if we see the root, we see it's based on beliefs that are erroneous at their core. The belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes, and the belief that I am the doer, the other is the doer. And those beliefs can be, when we see life differently, especially see it as a predetermined story unfolding according to God's will, and if that doesn't make sense because it feels like it's just a belief, we can start to investigate the mechanical nature of life and the fact that one thing happened because of what came before. And we see that we're all here in this room not because we made an independent decision 3 hours ago, but because everything that came before structured everything else such that each of us existed with a particular body-mind organism that was exposed to the information that this was here that wasn't in our control, and everything conspired for the thoughts and the feelings and the rickshaws to get us here or not get us here for the people that didn't make it. And that's what it means. Everything is happening as part of a much bigger whole that we're not in control of. And so if the falling away of our attitude of personal doership, which doesn't see that and says, I'm the one that made this thought arise and this feeling arise, if that changes, then we can start to see life as a predetermined happening, which means I'm not in control. So we don't know if we will have peace of mind, but we can see that if life conspires to undo the false beliefs, to undo the errors, then the error that stems from the error, which is the suffering, can collapse. It doesn't have to be there. It is an attitude based on a not knowing who we are. If suffering was an attitude based on a knowing of who we are, what we have to do is surrender to the fact that the end of suffering is not an availability. But as we start to see, all of my suffering is based on a story that in this teaching is described, a story based on doership and attachment to outcomes. And as we investigate, we find from our own experience, as our experience starts to demonstrate it, that in any moment we can drop into being and find ourselves at peace, even 5 minutes after receiving the email that says, the job that is a very good job has become redundant. You no longer have a job. And for 5 minutes we might freak out, and then the thought might remind us, I am, taking us back. Oh, I am. And the smile comes to our face. And we realize it's okay. I've lost jobs before. Things have turned out well. I lost a job 5 years ago. I thought it was a disaster, and the next job I got was fantastic and led to me getting this job that I've now just lost. And not to say in our head, I'm going to get an even better job, etc. It's like, it's actually, regardless, come back here, oh, I am. So we start getting our own first-hand confirmation that my happiness, my completeness isn't to be found in circumstance, because I know in the face of painful circumstance, I feel at peace, but rather it's to be found in my attitude to circumstance. So as we see this belief pop up in the form of uncomfortable feelings of attachment to outcome, where we say, oh, I'm feeling this way because I'm feeling bad because I don't have a partner. I'm feeling bad because of the way my mum's talking to me. Then we might realize, the suffering is because this belief is functioning. And then this dropping into being might start happening. So peace of mind is available, because the opposite of peace of mind, or what covers up peace of mind, is based on a false or erroneous or changeable attitude to life. So maybe next year, but there's no reason why it can't be in the next 2 minutes. If whatever uncomfortableness is there now is seen for what it is, the thought, my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, can arise and cut it off. If it's destined. You know, if our makeup is such that that thought doesn't arise, and that the belief of doership and attachment to outcomes persist, then it's destiny for the suffering to be there a little longer.
Would you want to say something more?
No.
You know, it was really interesting because the other day when I was going back, and I always have this thing about organic food and genetically modified food and how bad and good and blah. And then suddenly I just realized, well, so what? It's fine. And it was quite big for me to see that because I'm watching India go through its whole gen thing, and I was so upset before. And I was like, well, so what? Let it be. It's happening anyway. And I felt so happy to experience that it scared me because I was like, how am I reacting that way? What happened? And then I was like, all right, so this is good and bad. It's happening. It doesn't need me to have an opinion. And I felt more passive. But I was wondering that, say, like injustices happen, right? Like there's deforestation, and it is wrong, even though there is no good and bad, right? But in that act of destroying something that could preserve nature or something is by itself.
So it's wrong relative to a specific benchmark. That's important for us to see that. It's not wrong relative to the happening of life. Right? So if you change the benchmark and you're very conscious of which benchmark you put it against, you can say deforestation is wrong it seems wrong because we don't know what will happen once the forests collapse. We might have a new ecosystem that is better. So that's important for us to keep in mind, that we really don't understand the complexities of everything. But on a simple basis, you say, well, based on a best guess, it seems like the diversity is diminishing, and if we can preserve it, well, that seems like a good thing. So you say relative to, and understand that your view about what is good and bad relative to a particular benchmark is also relative, meaning you don't really know. But it's fair to take a stance, an opinion, to have an opinion, as long as you have the right attitude to your opinion, which is to understand it's not absolute, it's relative, and it's relative to a very specific benchmark. So relative to the benchmark of biodiversity, the deforestation is not good. If you hold that benchmark as an absolute benchmark and it obscures your view of life as a whole, you've now plummeted into an attack, a violence against the whole, essentially. Because you're saying this is what should and shouldn't be. So with this attitude, you say, I can see how preserving forests is a positive thing. I'll do whatever I can to play my role in preserving forests, but I know I'm not in control of the outcome. And when seen relative to the happening of life, the deforestation is, and I don't want to be attitudinally in opposition with what is. So there is the possibility inside of us to hold interest in a relative benchmark and do our best to affect the relative outcome without that interest obscuring our acceptance of the greater whole, which requires you to look at it in the way you're looking at, ask the questions, think about what I'm saying, find out for yourself how. So this relative to a specific benchmark is very important. If we can hold in mind that relative to life, which is interconnected opposites, which means there is health and disease, wealth and poverty, healthy children, disabled children, big and small, and that is the nature of the flow of life. right? So that means the duality is inherent in the non-duality. So the yin-yang symbol is a great example of this. The yin-yang symbol, when you look at it from the whole point of view, you see there is just one thing. But when you look at it on the detail, you see there is black and white interconnected that make up the whole. And the seeing of non-duality often happens when we diminish the existence of the interconnected opposites, and it allows us to stop being obsessed with one or the other and see the whole. And then there needs to be a refinement that says, oh, within the whole there are the interconnected opposites. And so if we keep our understanding on levels, let's say, they don't have to be contradictory to each other. I'll just end on a note about predetermination that I have to say that at some point, or for a large point of the dissolving of the habit of suffering, the seeing of life as a predetermined story created by Source, of which I am part. I am part of the story of life, part of the creation, was crucial. The creation is said, you can look at it as Source at rest before the creation. The unmanifest explodes into manifestation, becomes the creation. So it's not the creation and God outside, but God, which is just a label, it's a name. God will be whatever you think it is. In this example, I'm saying God as Source, being whatever all of this comes from. And God at rest in its unmanifest form, pure potentiality, according to these concepts, my concept in this case, is God in its unmanifest form can't be known by the created object. So the creator can't be known by the created object. So consciousness at rest, or God, has become consciousness in movement, the story of life from beginning of time to the end of time. And everything that happens, the thinking, the speaking, the actions within me and on the greater whole, is the unfolding of the predetermined story of life. So Ramesh used to say, the story has been written, acted, directed, produced, and it's in the can. And what we see moment after moment is the unfolding of the story of life. When we look at life as science looks at it, which doesn't say science understands it all, but it becomes important for us to start investigating life based on what presents on the various levels. And we have to acknowledge that science can see the levels better than us sometimes, especially when it comes to, let's say, quantum investigations, because we don't know how to use quantum microscopes, or we don't have one, or we don't understand the theory of it. So we assume that, okay, science has investigated the quantum level better than I have. They don't have the answers, but we can learn something. So they tell us about quantum entanglement, for example, where you change something in one place and a change somewhere else happens. And it's not really somewhere else, because on a quantum level there is no separation. So, but there's this these strange happenings that science is there. That's how it happens on a quantum level. And then on a mechanical level, we can investigate certain things, and what you don't actually have to understand the intricacies of things too much. But if we can see that mechanical physics is very much something that exists and gets put into action, so we build houses based on mechanical physics, and fly planes, yeah, are mechanical physics, that holds true on a certain level. And then when we dive deeper into things, we see the different laws hold true, and certain constants that exist on this level don't exist down on that level. And often we say, okay, now that if someone starts to understand quantum physics, which in spirituality is like, there's nothing, everything is nothing, is the sort of representation of quantum physics in spiritual teachings, that everything is really nothing. And if we start to see what that means, we sometimes think, oh, everything is really nothing, and we can tend to go, mechanical physics doesn't exist, and it's all, the truth is quantum physics. Whereas really they are two ends of the one thing, and really and we tend to see one and not the other, and then if we see the other, we discard the other, and we need to see both as interconnected. So when we see something, a principle, we often come to see that that principle repeats itself in life. So I'd be pretty comfortable, given that those two things, quantum and mechanical, are well investigated and sort of not completely understood. Physicists say we really don't really understand, but they understand a lot when you look at equations and calculations they can do, and things that they have observed. So if you take the general principle that these things coexist and they're equally as true and untrue as each other, and don't try and separate, one quantum as truth and mechanical as illusion, because you understand that it's not like that, then you can start including that principle into other things. So when it comes to spirituality, you say there needs to be two explanations. The quantum type explanation, which doesn't follow cause and effect, doesn't follow logic and time and space, because in quantum it's not there, and the mechanical. And you can hold them both together, and you don't even need to know both, because if you know one is as true and untrue as the other. So to know one level really is enough, because it's true. Or at least it's as true as the other level. So when it comes to something like predetermination, sorry, I thought this was going to be quick. There are two explanations. There's the explanation that say everything is predetermined. It's consciousness at rest has become the whole block of time and space, the whole of the whole of the universe or the multiverses, whatever. And it can seem like someone can either resonate with it and go, oh yeah, maybe because they just believe it, or they can see what is meant by that, or not. And if we can't run with that model, then there's another model, the mechanical model, let's say, which is the mechanical explanation of the same thing, because they're just two ends of the one thing. And the mechanical explanation of predetermination is if a leaf falls from a tree, it falls, and the path it takes to the ground and when it falls is completely predetermined. That's what the theory would be here. And someone goes, hey, what do you mean? How can you explain that? And without needing to go into the mystical explanations of and the quantum equivalent explanations of predetermination, we can hopefully come to see that this notion of predetermination is not just a belief. But I say, okay, when the leaf falls off the tree is completely predetermined, the exact point it falls off, and the path it takes, completely predetermined. It really just requires our mind to wrap itself around a bigger picture of causality than sort of drawing a line and seeing the leaf fall off as the beginning, and realize, oh, no, the leaf falling off is part of a continuum, that the tree grew, then the leaf grew, and the leaf has a particular biology to it, which means at a certain point in time, the leaf dies, and then the bond between the leaf and the tree gets weaker, and then wind comes along and knocks it, and when the bond is weak enough and the wind is strong enough, it gets separated from the tree. And then the way it falls is completely determined by the laws of the cosmos. Wind resistance, because the leaf is thing, and so it will zigzag. And all of those things are a result of factors that are in place that we don't control, that are essentially mechanical. And everything that came before. So even our thinking is a mechanical process. So Stephen Hawking said something, is everything predetermined? Is the name of one of his essays. And his answer was, yes, comma, everything is predetermined, comma. However, knowing everything is predetermined, I think that's the first sentence. However, knowing everything is predetermined doesn't mean we will know what is predetermined, because the system is so complex. So we can't calculate it, we can't crunch it, and understand what is going to happen. But in principle, when we look at it, if everything is about moving parts, just like on the pool table and you hit the white ball onto the... If you understand that if you did understand all the laws, and on a pool table we do, it's very easy to tell what the end result is going to be before it happens, because it's going to unfold according to very specific laws. So out in the world, it's all the same laws, but so many more variables that we can't determine what's going to happen, and yet what happens is predetermined according to those laws. And what we need to see is our thinking is simply electromagnetic physics in a neural network, was Stephen Hawking's explanation. So thinking is just physics. When we don't understand that, we see our thinking as the red herring in the mix of mechanics, because we say, oh, the thinking is my doing, instead of realizing that everything that happens in us is happening according to these causal mechanics. That's the mechanical explanation that might make it easier to understand that why the description everything is predetermined is not just a religious or mystical belief necessarily.